Good?
Yes.
Am I still the coolest person you know?
One of them.
One of them? Oh, by the way, this is, where did I get this hat? Where can they get this hat?
Actually got that hat from my booth, which is over there. We have not only hats, we have so many different things. We have bracelets, stickers, pins, necklaces, hats. So make sure to check that out.
Thanks, Vegan Evan.
All right. So, everyone, we've had some awesome speakers. We're going to have another one. But what I want to say is actually, there's this book that I helped write, and it's $10. Anyone who wants to get it, it's at my booth, or I'll be hanging around here because I'm saying, so you can get it from me. And also, our next speaker is Justin, and he's here to talk about animal rights in works of fiction. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. And also, he's a nerd. All right, here's Justin.
All right, this works, okay. All right, so we're good to go. So who here is ready to experience the weirdest animal rights presentation that you've ever heard? So what I'm going to be trying to do today is I'm going to be trying to convince you something that you might not already believe. And that's that the works of fiction that we create actually say more about our view of animal rights than our actual culture does. So, have you ever seen a person eating meat before? Probably. And have you ever seen a video of a little kid finding out about meat for the first time and how they don't want to eat meat anymore because they realize that it's one of the animals that they love? Probably. So a lot of times it's considered humorous when we look at the little kid because we think, oh, what a stupid little kid, they don't know anything about the world. Obviously, animals are meant for humans to eat. And I hate to say it, but the adults actually do have kind of a justification for this. And that's that adults have more critical thinking skills and knowledge than kids do. But on the other side, little kids are more like a blank slate, so they're more likely to not be a product of their conditioning. So they enter the world and they haven't been kind of victimized by the sort of culture that we've inflicted on everyone that currently lives here that's lived for a long time. So they're able to be sort of like a blank slate in the world, in a way. So, but what if there was a way to get both the benefits of being an adult and being a kid when we're thinking rationally about works of justice? So there's a concept in philosophy called utilitarianism, and that's that the greatest moral good is whatever increases pleasure and decreases suffering for the greatest amount of individuals that can experience pleasure and suffering. So the concept of the benevolent onlooker exists in utilitarian philosophy, and what it is it is a creature that is not benefited or hurt by anything that it decides, and the only purpose that it has is to make sure that the world is the best place that it can be. So we can think of this sort of like an alien looking at Earth, and if this was a super cool, nicest alien you've ever met in your life, and all it wants is for us to be happy, what would it decide? We can actually kind of be like that alien, but not for the world we already exist in, but for the worlds of fiction that we're examining and creating. So, there's an alien that comes to Earth, and Stephen King's It that isn't quite as nice as the alien that I discussed earlier. So when we look at this work of fiction, we think that the little kids are the heroes of the story, and It is the villain because it tries to kill them. But what if I told you that the relationship between the kids and It, who is the villain, was a little bit more complicated than we thought it was? So when you look at It and the little kids, a lot of these words probably didn't come to mind, right? So free range, children allowed to live in their natural environment. So if these were made by a meat company, this is how they would advertise their product, is we would say, oh, this product is so good, these animal products are so good, you should come and consume them. And the reason why is because we treat our animals better than anyone else does. And yet, all of these things are also true that monsters in horror movies try to victimize us, and they don't use these same exact examples, even though all of them are all true. So it could seemingly go on forever with all of the excuses that horror movie monsters could possibly use to justify killing us. And I'm sure you've all heard these before. So believe it or not, I'm not the first person to make this comparison, and it's kind of subtle, but the movie actually makes the comparison itself. So there's a compassionate character named Mike Hanlon that exists in the movie, and his grandfather is a sheep farmer. So he doesn't want to be a sheep farmer like his grandfather, and one interesting thing that happened is there's a scene in the movie, and I was in the movie theater watching it when this happened, where he is forced to put a bolt gun to a sheep's head, and the entire theater gasped when they found this out. And it's like they have no idea how the food even gets to their table. So the children of dairy and livestock, it makes a direct comparison because animals are to the children of dairy what the children of dairy are to it, the clown. So I think this is a very interesting example because we learn that none of the justifications that we have for killing and consuming animals mean anything to us if we were the victim. And also, the greatest horror story ever told actually exists in real life because there are no horror stories that exist in works of fiction in which there's 56 billion land animals or 56 billion victims that exist that are killed every single year. So imagine if there was a horror movie monster that actually did that. It would be the most violent horror movie monster that ever existed. And the amount of marine animals that we kill can only be measured in tons just because it's so many. But this wouldn't even be a really scary movie if something like this happened because I'm sure you've all heard the quote that if there's enough victims, they become statistics and not victims. So we can't even consider them anymore. So as the most intelligent species on the planet, which is commonly what we use to justify harming animals, even with our great intelligence, we can't even understand or process the amount of harm that we do to animals. So anyway, this next subject is My Little Pony, so a little bit of a change of pace here. So, are they vegan in My Little Pony? Not necessarily, because Pinkie Pie is a pony that eats eggs and milk, but yet at the same time, the cows can talk, so maybe they just sell their own milk, who really knows? But the real important part of My Little Pony is called the element of kindness. So it's a supernatural artifact that is bestowed upon a pony named Fluttershy. So Fluttershy is a Pegasus pony, and the reason she's given the element of kindness is because she's considered the pinnacle of all kindness, and what the show does to exemplify that is that she's very kind to animals. So if a parent was watching this with their kids, they wouldn't see this and think, wait a minute, so why is it that someone who's nice to animals is considered all nice and all that? But the thing is, when we're kind to animals, we consider that a nice thing to do, and when we're mean to animals, we consider that a mean thing to do. However, we factory farm animals as well, so where does that fit into all of this? Because we're not allowed to say in real life that if someone factory farms animals or pays someone to factory farm animals that they're an evil person necessarily. But yet, whenever the horror story that we inflict upon animals in the form of factory farming isn't mentioned, then we consider animal rights almost universal. For vegans and non-vegans, they view animals in the same way. But whenever factory farming comes into the picture, then suddenly that kind of harm towards animals doesn't count. So on the right, she's currently yelling at everyone who's suggesting that the animals in Sweet Feather Animal Sanctuary are supposed to be kept in cages. So even in the fictional alternate universe of My Little Pony where they're all humans, they're all still vegetarians, so what you see right there is actually a hay burger. So these are concepts about animal rights that even children can understand. So I'm done talking about My Little Pony and horse people, so let's move into another horse people show, BoJack Horseman. So anthropomorphic animals are animals that are essentially half human and half animal. So you see them in cartoons all the time. And you also see humans in cartoons all the time, but usually you don't see them together. So BoJack Horseman is unique in that both of them are pictured at the same time. So Zootopia is a vegan society, that is a Disney movie, so credit to them for having a vegan society where animals live in peace, and it kind of addresses the concept of eating meat. But on the right, we have the Mickey Mouse gang. And in Mickey Mouse, this is never addressed, and they even have a regular dog. And if you look at Pluto's face, he looks almost identical to Goofy's face. But most people don't even notice and just consider this kind of concept they don't think about, that Pluto is a dog, and yet Goofy is also basically a dog, and yet they're both considered completely different things. So in BoJack Horseman, there's an episode that directly references factory farming, and it relates it to humane practices of farming, and it's called Chickens, which is just the name of the episode. So on the left, it's considered a ridiculous concept that the humane chicken farmer farms chickens, and then he gives them foosball to justify how he's treating them. So he says, oh, I don't torture my animals, we treat our animals the best because we're chickens and we know what chickens want, and yet he makes them play foosball, which is considered a ridiculous concept to us. But if you think about humane farming and the advertising they do to sell us humane products, they say, oh, well, these animals are allowed to exist in their natural environment, they're allowed to exhibit natural behaviors and things like that, but what they really are is they're just imprisoned outside, and we're deciding as humans what is best for chickens, and then saying, you see, these chickens live fulfilling lives, but the chickens have no say in what they actually think is fulfilling to them. But it's obviously not as bad as factory farming, which is pictured on the right. So Chicken for Days is both a restaurant and a factory farm by the same name, and it's directly addressed in this next scene, where there's a channel called MSNBC, where there's a news anchor talking to a factory farming CEO. And the CEO, when he is addressed about the human horror story in which we inflict so much suffering upon animals, he states that everything that we do is legal and FDA approved, therefore it's fine. And that's considered a joke. However, that actually exists in real life where people think, oh, these government regulators are saying that all these things we do to animals are fine, therefore nothing that we do to animals in regards to factory farming is actually bad because it's all legal. So there's a question that I actually want you all to answer, so if everyone could pay attention a little bit. So if there was an animal that was suffering a lot, its entire life was sickness, and it was in horrible pain its entire life, would it be ethical in order to euthanize that animal? Okay, so what if that animal actually wasn't suffering at all, and it was actually the happiest animal you've ever seen? Do you think it would be justified to kill that animal and consume it? So there's a lot of people that think that both of these concepts can exist at the same time within the same person. So if an animal is sad enough, we can kill it. But also if an animal is happy enough, we can kill it too, which if nothing else is food for thought. So imagine if somebody had a dog, right? And they raised their dog for a couple of years, and they said, my dog is big enough now and I've treated it really well, so now I can kill and eat my dog. And most people would think that was a ridiculous concept. Now it can get even worse if someone raises their kid to about 7 years old and then says, I've done a really good job raising my child, they've had a lot of fun, so now I think I'm going to kill and eat my kid. Most people would think that person should be sent to prison immediately if they did something like that. And yet, this is the same kind of thing we think is actually ethical or honorable when it comes to consuming animals. So, when we think of government regulation on factory farming, you ask people, do you think that the government is corrupt? And I'd like to ask you all, do you think that the current government in the United States is corrupt? Now, do you think that big industry is also corrupt? So if we have government employees going back and forth between industry and government in the same regulatory functions that they're supposed to be keeping themselves from doing, do we really think that we can trust people that go in between industry and government to regulate each other? Most people would say probably not. And yet this is the same kind of lie that we consume every single time we go to the grocery store and we buy humanely raised products. And this also references the human horror story that I was going back to, where there's no more horrifying monster than humans, and if animals were able to make their own stories, humans would be the villains. So this is a mouse trap right here. What goes into a mouse trap? Mice, that's correct. But what if it wasn't a mouse, it was actually a Pikachu? So this is a macerator, and it's on a factory farm. So does anyone know what goes into macerators on factory farms? Baby chicks, exactly. But what if it wasn't a baby chick? Except it kind of was. It was a tour chick. So the concept of humans eating Pokemon actually does exist in the video games. So in the newest Pokemon game, Pokemon Sword and Shield, they have something called Pokemon Sausage. So whenever Nintendo brings this up publicly, and there's any way to leave comments, people always ask, which Pokemon is the sausage made out of? Because the concept of people eating Pokemon is very, very strange, because they're supposed to live in peace and respect with the Pokemon around them. And we always believe that if we were to go to the Pokemon world, we would treat them with the same respect. And treating Pokemons with respect is considered normal. However, they actually have an organization, it's a gang, it's called Team Rocket, where they actually don't treat Pokemon with respect, and they're considered the villains of the story, or the games. So in this particular scene right here, what they're doing is they're cutting off Slowpoke's tail, which is the Pokemon on the right, and then they're selling it on the black market. So everyone thinks that this is illegal, and it is, in the Pokemon universe, and they're considered the villains, so they try to stop them. However, there's actually a very different game that's also considered the villains of the story, and Pokemon Black and White, which ironically in Pokemon Black and White is the closest they ever get to a moral gray area in the Pokemon series. So they're trying to convince people, this gang right here, that people shouldn't have Pokemon, because Pokemon want to be free. So they have Pokemon liberation rallies, and they have Pokemon liberation speeches, sort of like the animal rights speeches that I'm doing right now. And then they can also try to convince Pokemon to go into people's brains and leave thoughts of Pokemon liberation. So PETA, of course, being PETA, they noticed that this was the plot for one of the Pokemon games where they had a gang that was extremely similar to PETA themselves. So they made their own Pokemon fan game to try to milk it for everything that it was worth. So a lot of people, when they played these games, they thought they were kind of dumb, and they're probably right. However, at the end of the game, they explained exactly why they made the game in the first place, and it was to show people that if we all went to the Pokemon world, we wouldn't be treating animals with respect based on the historical context of how we've treated every kind of animal on Earth, right? So, if you existed in the Pokemon world, would you support factory farms for Pokemon, troll testing on Pokemon, skinning Pokemon for their fur, and etc., etc.? So there's also a Pokemon called Mewtwo that has scientific tests done on it, and it decides that it hates humans. So a lot of these concepts are actually discussed in the games themselves. One of the most interesting series, in my opinion, is Star Trek, because they have a completely different view on animal rights and how they discuss it compared to every other work of fiction. So in Star Trek, what they do is they don't discuss animal rights as something that's currently happening. Because it exists in the future, they consider animal rights movement something that has already come and passed. So everyone already agrees that harming animals is wrong. So what we see in the top right, the context of this quote right here, is that there's an alien species and their philosophy hasn't advanced to the point where they decide that eating animals is wrong. So they come to the Starship Enterprise, which is where they all live, and they demand that they have animal meat. So he rejects the request for animal meat, and he says that we no longer enslave animals for food purpose anymore. So this isn't a gender equality speech, and I'm not here to necessarily talk about toxic masculinity, but all I'm saying is that if there was such an idea called non-toxic masculinity, then this would be it. So all of these quotes in Star Trek are actually real, which is crazy because it's so directly referencing animal rights, and this is something that came out so long ago as well. So there is one episode of Star Trek in which they directly reference animal rights, and that's in the episode called I, Borg. So for context, the Borg are a hive mind race, and what they do is they assimilate other races and traumatize them in their quest for power. However, what isn't constantly thought about is that each individual member of the Borg is its own individual, and it could be considered victimized by its own race as well. So they actually end up rescuing a Borg right here, and they try to use the Borg to commit genocide on its own race. So what they want to do is they want to program something that would end up killing every single Borg that existed in the universe, because they all are a hive mind. So what happens is everyone on the Starship Enterprise hates the Borg. But yet when they all meet this individual Borg, they start to learn that it can actually learn ethical concepts, and they can actually be friends with it, and they can actually treat it as an individual. So a lot of times we view animals as a collective, which is why we don't have respect for them. So what happens is the person who's most traumatized by the Borg is the main character, Captain Picard, because he's actually abducted by the Borgs himself. So he wants to commit genocide on their entire race. So Geordi right here goes up to talk to Captain Picard, and he says, maybe you should meet the Borg yourself, and I think that you may have a change of heart. So he says that everyone should stop associating with the Borg, and the reason why is because in the past there were scientists that used to have respect for the animals that they were experimenting on, and when they were able to meet the animals in person that they were experimenting on, they would start to have compassion for them, which became a problem when they decided that they had to torture and kill them. So I just want to give a lot of credit to Star Trek just because they're such a strong animal rights work of fiction. So there's a concept of WWJD, what would Jesus do, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want you all to think WWSD, or what would Spock do? So if there was an alien, like I discussed earlier, that was viewing our use of animals, and they were viewing our world and our ethics and everything like that, would they think that it was logical for us to cause great harm to trillions of sentient creatures for just the purpose of taste pleasure? And for context, Spock is a Vulcan, and the Vulcans follow a utilitarian philosophy, which basically means that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and they try to be as logical as possible. So would it be logical to not only do the first thing that I discussed, but also to destroy the planet that we live on just because we decide that we want the taste pleasure from animals? And then we're also going to ignore all the scientific bodies that tell us that animal agriculture is bad for us, it's bad for the environment, and then it's bad for animals as well. So there's a series that's constantly compared to Star Trek a lot, and that's Star Fox. So I'm just kidding about this section, but Star Fox is a big missed opportunity because they're anthropomorphic animals, just like in BoJack Horseman, and they also travel through space, just like in Star Trek, and yet they never discuss it. So here's where hoping the Star Fox game comes out where they actually discuss this topic, but it does have a fox being crewmates with a hare, which I guess is a start. So on the left, we see a scene where Chewbacca is eating a species called the porg. So when people see this scene, they think it's actually very simple, but it's actually more complicated than I believe that people give credit for. So on the right, we see that he eventually becomes friends with the porg because he starts viewing the porg as an individual. And he views the trauma that it's going through watching its friends or comrades be essentially eaten by Chewbacca. So one thing that's interesting about this scene is that Chewbacca and the porg are actually non-humans. So if other humans in the series like Han Solo or anything like that believe that Chewbacca should die because he was either less intelligent than him or he decided that he should die because he's a different species than him. So excuses that we use in order to harm animals in our real life, we would think that was ridiculous. In every work of fiction in which humans travel to outer space, they treat all these aliens and other species with so much respect. But in real life, we wouldn't expect humans to actually treat all these alien species and everything with respect because we didn't discriminate against other species and each other so much. So there's a city called Canto Bight, and there's two characters in Star Wars. One is named Finn and one is named Rose. So Finn absolutely loves the city of Canto Bight, but Rose hates it, and yet they're looking at the same exact city, so how could this be? So Rose understands that this beautiful city was built on the backs of suffering human slaves, as well as other alien species slaves and animals. So she understands that even though the city is beautiful, it's actually a disgusting city once you look into it. So she's making complicated decisions that a lot of us take for granted whenever we sit down to have a meal. We think how much suffering went into whatever we're consuming currently. So on the left, we have a very disgusting scene, which is a human being drinking milk. So I know that kind of seems like a joke, and this is like a joke scene, but it's actually very telling for how we actually view animal ethics in real life. So imagine that there was a human adult, and they were still drinking their mom's breast milk. Most people would be disgusted by that. But imagine that person instead wasn't drinking their mom's breast milk, but they were drinking goat milk, or they were drinking, even worse, pig milk, or dog milk, or anything like that. So anytime it doesn't come from a cow, we think it's disgusting. And the reason why is because we're culturally ingrained to believe that. So on the right, we see Daisy Ridley, or the character Rey in Star Wars. So Daisy Ridley is her voice, or her actress. So Daisy Ridley is actually a vegan in real life. So it's hard to say whether her reaction to the scene is actually genuine or not. So believe it or not, the fact that she's vegan is actually only the second coolest thing about Rey, with the first being that her name is just a combination of two characters from Smash Bros. So in Solo, a Star Wars story, we actually see something that's very relatable to animal rights. So it's not the first science fiction story to discuss this, but I have a question for you all again. So if there was a sentient AI, so artificial intelligence that was able to reach the point of sentience, do we all think that if there was a robot that was able to obtain thoughts and feelings and wants and desires and was able to feel pain and suffering, should we take that into consideration when we're using droids or robots or anything else? So what if I told you that it actually wasn't artificial intelligence, it was actually organic intelligence? So imagine if there was a creature that existed in the real world that actually had pain and suffering and so on and so on. Should we take that into consideration? And most people would say yes as well. But the thing is, we're able to accept these works of fiction, we're able to accept that droids should have rights if they were able to reach the point of sentience so easily. And I believe the reason why is because we don't currently eat them 3 times a day. So we're much more biased in our consideration of the species that exist on this planet because we've been taught that we should abuse them and we should use them for whatever we want. But when it comes up to like works of fiction, then we say, oh, well, if there was something that was able to be sentient, then we shouldn't use it in however we please because it has thoughts and feelings and et cetera, et cetera. So here's a little recap. So in the Planet of the Apes, it's a story about a human named Taylor, he's a scientist, who travels off into space, and then there's some time warp hooey-fooey, and he lands back on Earth in the future when it's dominated by apes. But he thinks that it's this completely new planet. So in the Planet of the Apes right here, we see the character Taylor on trial, where they're thinking about imprisoning him or using a lobotomy on him or anything like that. And then he starts to realize that it isn't as easy to obtain rights as he thinks it is because he's a human in ape society. So what he does is he realizes that the ape society is a system of power that favors the powerful. And we start to realize as well that this is exactly how human society works today. So the way that ape society works, for context, is that there's the domain of faith, and then there's the domain of war. So the domain of faith is dominated by orangutans, so they're kind of like the politicians of their world. And they believe that the supreme lawgiver, which is their version of God, says that they're allowed to do whatever they want to humans, who are considered like a subservient species in the world. And then whenever the gorillas want to quash anything beneath them, or they want to hunt humans, or they want to have wars against humans and kill them all, then the gorillas are justified because they believe that apes are the dominant species and therefore they should be able to do whatever they want. And then this cycles back around to faith because the faith orangutans, they have every single reason to believe that they're the dominant species on the world because the gorillas quash everything beneath them. So which asks the question of, where do the chimpanzees fit into all of this? So chimpanzees dominate the domain of science, and science is discovery. So the scientist chimpanzees, they discover things, and some of the things that they discover fit in line with what the orangutans want in the preservation of ape society, and some of them don't. So they have to filter all of their information through the orangutans. So that means that chimpanzees, even though the orangutans say that all apes are considered equal, the chimpanzees actually are not. So language is very important in ape society because the humans in this world actually can't talk. So the apes decide that they're stupid and they don't give them any rights. So this is kind of an interesting thing because when we were trying to test ape intelligence in the past, what we used to do is we tried to get them to talk to us. And then we realized that the reason that apes can't talk isn't because they're stupid necessarily, but it's because they don't have the same vocal apparatus and able to talk. So it directly references that as well. So in the third movie, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, we actually get to see all of these comparisons actually come to realization because scientists are actually able to meet the chimpanzees because they time travel back to Earth in the past and present day. And then we get to see politicians and we get to see soldiers and we get to see how the chimpanzees interact with them. So what happens is the scientists are the protagonists of the story essentially just like in the first movie, and then we get to see the politicians realize that the chimpanzees are a threat to their society. So because the chimpanzees are a threat to human society, they realize this because the chimpanzees tell them about the story about the ape revolution, where humans were so mean to ape society that they eventually had to rebel against the humans, and the chimpanzees think that the humans in the past are going to understand this, but all the humans here, even though it was completely the humans' fault, was that chimpanzees essentially ruined their society. So what they do is they send the soldiers to execute the chimpanzees. So we get to see the exact same plot that essentially occurred in the first movie take a completely different change of tone once we change spots with them. So another thing that actually shows that ape society is actually more kind than the current society that we live in is the concept of the ape scripture. So the lawgiver that I mentioned earlier is their version of God, and we get to see exactly how it plays out in the film. So they actually get to see exactly what the lawgiver is telling them, and there's actually historical context for how the lawgiver gives laws. So the reason that they hate the humans so much and why they think it's fine and justified to kill them is actually because humans have destroyed the planet before the apes eventually dominated it. So they actually do kind of have a reason, and that's that humans were so bad to the apes and so bad to every other species on the planet, and they were so bad to the environment and ended up destroying it, that we hate animals and we destroy them in factory farms and things like that because we believe that they're stupid and they're lesser than us. But the reason that apes hate us in the Planet of the Apes movies is because they think that we're evil. So what this is showing right here is essentially that if we have any kind of creature, in this case I'm using the console wars because all these consoles came out at around the same time, but all you really need to know is that the Xbox 360 was the most powerful console. So what we see here is that imagine a world where all these consoles are sentient and Xbox 360 rules the world, and it wants to decide exactly what rights every other console gets. So if you had to decide what is the best species or what is the coolest species or what is the best console or what's the coolest console, if the world is dominated by Xbox 360s, because they have the best processing power, they're going to say, well, Xbox 360s are the best, and the reason why is because they have the best processing power. So even though they're going to destroy the world, most people would say, well, actually, Xbox 360 is actually the worst console because they ruin everything for everything around them. And yet, humans use that same justification for why we're the best and why we should destroy everything around us. And that's because we're the best and we have the highest processing power, we're the most intelligent. But if you look at it from the outside in, that doesn't make any sense to us. So have you ever heard someone say that humans are the best species on the planet because we're the most intelligent? Or we've said that maybe humans are the most different species on the planet and therefore we can dominate anything else. So what if that same person who was using that argument against you decided that they were going to, an alien was going to abduct them and then take them to their planet and then say, well, we can do whatever we want to this human because it's less intelligent to us and it's a different species. So this actually happens in a series called Madoka Magica, where the main character, Madoka, meets this alien that's much more cute than the last alien, and it decides that it's able to harvest energy from little girls. So the main character, Madoka, on the right, tries to explain to Kyubey, which is the little alien on the left, that it's being unethical because it's farming children, essentially for energy. And then it says, do you even know how the food comes to sit at your table? Because what Kyubey is actually doing is, it's a much more intelligent, different species than Madoka, so it's much superior to her. And it says, this is the exact same thing that you do to factory farmed animals. So if she was vegan, she would be able to clap back at him, but unfortunately she wasn't. So this is actually a very similar concept to the horror movie Stephen King's It that I just discussed earlier. So Lisa the Vegetarian, I would recommend you just watch on your own time if you have YouTube, it's on there. So it discusses a lot of animal rights themes and how it feels to be a vegetarian in a meat-eating society. And then there's South Park Let Them Eat Goo, which is another episode that I would recommend watching. So there's actually a lot of Disney villains that actually exist in real life with us. So most people have seen a hunter, most people have seen a person wearing fur. And then most people have seen a scuba diver, whether they catch fish or not, like in Finding Nemo. And then we've also seen maybe trophy hunters or poachers or anything like that on documentaries. So these people all exist in society with us. But the thing is, they're all considered Disney villains. Like, for example, we have Clayton on the right, and then we have the person who captured Finding Nemo on the left, and then we have Cruella de Vil and the person who killed Bambi's mom. But what I'm trying to say by this essentially is that if a story was created by animals, we understand exactly why humans would be the villain. So in a lot of Disney movies, because the main characters are animals, we get to see humans as a villain, which makes a lot of sense to us. And yet, we kind of accept these people into our society and accept this behavior. So the last concept that I kind of want to discuss is mentioned in Attack on Titan, where they start to make comparisons between humans and livestock. So what makes a story worth telling? So on the right we have Armin with the blonde hair, and on the left we have Eren, who's the main character. And he criticizes Armin for trying to escape the Titans and submitting to them like a cow does to the farmer. But I don't think this is a fair comparison, because cattle will chase after their calves, they'll bite at the bars, and they'll try to escape from their situation, but the thing is they don't win. So it kind of brings up the subject of what makes something considered a victim. So why is it that humans are always considered victims, and then whenever we see a tortured animal, we consider that a victim, but when we see an animal tortured for food, we don't consider it a victim in our society? So we can't say that it's nature, because appeal to nature exists in philosophical discussions, and the reason why it doesn't work, it's considered a fallacy, is because there's plenty of things that exist in nature that we fight back against. And we don't think that nature is always valuable. We don't think it's always what we should listen to. So for example, we fight back against disease, we take people to the hospital, we fight back against predators that try to kill us, and we don't believe that natural disasters are a good thing. We also don't believe that might makes right. So Titans are much more mighty than the humans that exist in the Attack on Titan universe. So we don't think that the Titans should just slaughter all of the humans. And we don't think that bullies should bully the weak. And we don't think that any kind of oppressive society is justified just because it's more powerful than whatever's beneath them. So when we think about factory farming, we think of all these pigs and all these chickens at the same time. We don't consider them as individuals. However, even regular people who aren't vegan are able to see the individuality whenever, like, a cow escapes from on the way to a slaughterhouse, or a pig escapes on the way to a slaughterhouse. So all of the things that existed, like all of those pigs in that slaughterhouse truck, we don't even consider them at all. However, when something fights back against its oppression, then it certainly becomes a story worth telling. So do you think that anyone would listen to a story about a villain that just quashes a hero? So if you went to the bookstore, you picked up a comic book, and then it was just a 3-page comic book, and all it had was a villain stomping on a hero, most people would think that was a terrible story. And that kind of makes sense because we don't listen to real stories that are like that either. So like I said, we kill so many animals that we can't even count, and we don't consider them actual things with actual stories. But yet, they can actually be considered heroes of their own story because they fight back, but they just don't win. And then we see cows that are trying to get back to their calves that were taken away from them. And does that mean that just because they don't win that their story doesn't matter? So one of the concepts that I've been trying to push in this presentation, that I'm trying to keep subtle at the same time, is that stories don't only exist in works of fiction. So every creature in the entire world has a story, so every piece of sentient life has a story because it has its own experiences. And just because something has a sad ending doesn't mean that it's a story that shouldn't be told. So I think that sad stories or stories that don't have a happy ending are very important because they show us that something went wrong somewhere down the line. So I think that if people believe that the only stories that should be told are stories that have a happy ending, then I think we should start giving animals a happy ending. And that's why I think that DXC and these organizations that rescue animals are so important. So thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Evan, Vegan Evan, we need you.